Welcome to Chapter 25, Cold War America from 1945 to 1963. Let's get started. So we need to look at the whole concept of containment and how the world was divided globally after World War II. So the origins of the Cold War. And here's this question: is the enemy of your enemy your friend or your enemy? And that's a very interesting thing to look at, especially when you look at the big three during World War II. If you look at the pictures to the right of this presentation, first with Churchill, FDR, and Stalin, and then later on it'll be, I think, Atwill or Attlee, Truman and Stalin in 1946. So at Yalta was the last meeting of the big three, and Stalin promised free and unfettered elections in Poland at a later date. As you know in your reading, that was a promise that was not kept. There's a very big concern about Poland and how it was going to be handled after World War II, since it was created after World War I, and both the Germans and the Soviets wanted dibs at it. Obviously the Germans are done, or going to be done and out of the picture. So there was a real concern about free elections in Poland. Germany was divided into four quadrants, four zones: the United States, Britain, France, and Russia. The United Nations and UN was agreed upon also at Yalta. At the Potsdam Conference, Truman replaced FDR at the Potsdam Conference, and Stalin did not allow self-determination in Eastern Europe. You're going to see Stalin hardening his position. His argument's going to be is that we were invaded twice in two wars by Germany and from the West. And he wanted to create these satellite states, or this buffer zone, to protect Russia from future invasion. So this whole self-determination, if it wasn't under the Soviet orbit or influence, which basically is communist, Stalin would not be comfortable with those countries. Also, what you had in your reading tonight is Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, where this is called the Iron Curtain for the first time, is where Stalin has these satellite states, these Eastern European states, and where they end to the west, it looks as an Iron Curtain. It's not a very good viewpoint or the way to put it, and it was not meant to be, let's say, complimentary. So further on containment, the containment strategy, there were three issues that concerned President Truman. The Soviet Union wanted to access oil in Iran and the Mediterranean through Turkey. Now, the Soviets had their own oil, but they wanted to control more so then they could control oil prices. If oil prices stayed up, that was the way where the Soviets could pay for their nation and also their military sustainability. There was also a civil war in Greece. You have the monarchist versus the Communist Party. And there's a real concern that communists would win in Greece. Remember, at the end of a big war, a lot of nations tend to be desperate towards totalitarian, authoritarian type of governments after the devastation of war, and Greece was one of them. Communist parties increased in popularity as the economy of Europe suffered. It's just what I said before. As the economy suffered, communism will say, hey, everybody's going to have work, everybody's going to have money, everybody's going to be equal. Collectivism, we work together, it sounds really good and looks good on paper. So toward an uneasy peace, you have George F. Kennan. He urged the containment of the Soviet Union through counterforce. That means that anywhere it looks like that communism is going to spread, you look to stop that and to contain it. Do not allow it to spread. If it does, minimize its spread. The Truman Doctrine provided $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey to resist communism. Okay? So, two countries, there was a big concern, was Greece and Turkey. 300 million of it went to Greece, about 100 million of it went to Turkey. And then there's the Marshall Plan, which was resisted by Congress early on. But as events unfolded in Europe, and it became very clear that the Soviets were involved in expansion in the region, 13 billion was spent to help rebuild war-torn Europe and hoped to make communism less appealing. So different countries would get different investments, but this also helped American businesses be able to forge very favorable relationships and partnerships and business relationships with different companies in different countries. So it was an economic boom for American manufacturers and business, but also people don't tend to vote for communism when their economy is going well and they have a job and their prospects are good. The Marshall Plan is looked at. It's named after George Marshall, who was the Secretary of State at the time under Truman. Many believe without the Marshall Plan, probably a lot of Europe would have gone communist or become under the Soviet orbit. Now, there's people that disagree with that, but just putting it out there. And the Marshall Plan is seen as a major, major achievement of the Harry Truman administration. And because of that, many historians will rank or grade Truman as a near great or great president, a lot of times in the top 10. And a lot of it has to do with the Marshall Plan. The Soviet Union rejected the aid and forbade Eastern European countries from receiving aid as well. So the Soviets saw the Marshall Plan money as something that would be counterproductive to their aims. They would say that the Americans are trying to buy off support of these countries, and this is how the capitalists run things here. So the Soviet Union wanted no part of it, and it's going to help, let's just say, cement separation between the two orbits, the Americans, the United States, and the Soviet Union. So more on the containment strategy, the East and West in the new Europe. Well, first you have the Berlin blockade in June of 1948. Where the Soviets closed off the roadways into Berlin. Berlin is 100 miles into East Germany, which was Soviet controlled. But there was always open access to Berlin because half of Berlin, or a good amount of it, was free. It was not communist. So Stalin was like, okay, we're going to block this off so you can't get anything into Berlin. Well, so then Truman is going to bring it in by airlift. And about a ton of supplies was dropped for every person in West Berlin. That's quite a bit. 2.5 million tons, it was about 2.5 million people. So it was an enormous operation. And finally, Stalin is going to yield to that and stop the blockade of the roads. During this time, also, you have the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known today as NATO. It's a peacetime alliance. And the whole idea is an attack on one is an attack on all. This is the first time the United States ever engaged in a peacetime alliance in its history. In the NATO member countries, the big ones are like Great Britain, France, today Turkey's in NATO, Belgium, Northern Europe, the Netherlands, I believe even Portugal originally was in as the NATO nations. There's a list in your book. I don't know if I have the list here. The Soviet Union responded later with the Warsaw Pact. The Eastern European countries are going to put together, they get together in Warsaw and they sign a pact that they're going to stick together with the same idea, an attack on one is attack on all. And so that would be anything east of this so-called or phrased Iron Curtain. So Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Romania, I believe Bulgaria, you name it from there, Ukraine, and going further east. Then there's NSC, National Security Council Document 68, that painted the USSR more starkly than Kennan ever did, and you have that in your packet also. It led to a drastic buildup of the military. and it just basically showed the Soviet Union as aggressive and offensive in its stance. They were looking to expand and had the goal to expand. At the same time, there's a whole concern about containment in Asia. It isn't just Europe, but Asia too. There's a civil war in China, the communists, which was Mao Zedong, and versus the nationalist Chiang Kai-shek. So you have the communists versus the nationalists. They've been in the civil war since the 1930s. Truman eventually cut off aid to Chiang, and Mao and the communists took control. Now, that's going to be a big, big rallying cry of Republicans against Harry Truman and his foreign policy, saying that Truman just basically gave away China. And so when Chiang Kai-shek lost the aid from the United States, they took place in what's today known as Taiwan. At the time it was known as Formosa. As the island is been known as Free China. Until this day, there's always a question in presidential elections: what are you going to do? Are you going to recognize Taiwan? Is there going to be a one China policy and that kind of stuff? And it goes all the way back to this time, 1947, 1948. Truman was blamed for losing China. I just said that. And then the Korean War is going to come to be. Korea was divided at the 30th parallel between the USSR, the Soviet Union, supported the North, and the United States supported the South. North Korea attacked the South in June of 1952, trying to, quote, unite, unquote, Korea. North Korea, communist. South Korea, not communist. Truman fired General MacArthur for criticizing the war. What ended up happening in Korea was a couple things. First, North attacked South, and then MacArthur was able, they went very south. They almost took over all of South Korea. MacArthur's going to push back and push the North Koreans back over the 38th parallel and keep going north all the way towards the Chinese border. And MacArthur wanted to strike against the Chinese to have them push back and stop them from invading. And what ended up happening is the Chinese ended up invading north and started pushing the U.S. troops, and those troops with the South Koreans back, mostly U.S. troops. Also understand, too, this was considered a police action of the United Nations. When North Korea attacked the South in June of 1952, the United Nations Security Council gave the United States, or ordered this police action to stop North Korea and push them back out of South Korea from that invasion. The reason why it got through the Security Council, what is the UN Security Council that was agreed upon? It would be the United States, France, Great Britain, Russia, a couple other countries in there. Russia was protesting, would not be part of the UN or the Security Council at the time, because the United States would not recognize China to become part of the United Nations or even part of the Security Council. So that's how Truman and the Americans were able to get the Security Council to okay this so-called police action in Korea. So MacArthur was pretty aggressive, and he believed that the Chinese needed to be engaged, maybe go into China a little bit and push them back and send them a message. Truman's viewpoint is if he did that, you're looking at a full-scale war with China. And the concern was that the country wouldn't support this. It looked more offensive in nature. Okay, we're stopping South Korea from becoming communist and that kind of stuff. But to go and push into China, Truman didn't believe there'd be support for that, and he nor the Democrats supported that. Conservatives and Republicans, but more conservative Republicans, supported where MacArthur's stance was on this, was to be aggressive and defeat the Chinese communists now so they don't become a problem later. Well, because MacArthur did not follow Truman's orders to pull back, he relieved MacArthur of his command, or you can say fired, for criticizing the war publicly and really strongly resisting Truman's orders as commander-in-chief. And Again, historians look at this as a very important time in Truman's presidency and makes him a near great president because he stood up for the civilian control of the military, that the commander-in-chief is in charge, not a general, General MacArthur. And when MacArthur came back to the United States after he relieved the command, there were parades all throughout the country. He was welcomed as a hero, and a lot of people were afraid that MacArthur was going to run for president in 1948, and this kind of fear that, you know, a general might take over the country and be very militaristic against communism. And one of the little cities that MacArthur had a parade, it's somewhere with my stuff. He had a parade, a welcome back parade in Attleboro, Massachusetts. I think the year was 48 or 40, no, it was 1950. And when he came back, there was a parade in Attleboro, because at the time the House leader was Joseph Martin from North Attleboro. He might even have been the speaker at the time. He went back and forth between being minority leader and speaker of the House. And that's the reason why the parade came to Attleboro. I have a flag and a pin. My father was 5 or 6 years old, 6 or 7 years old, and he went to that parade with his mother, my grandmother. And somewhere I have a little flag that he waved at it and a pin in honor of General MacArthur. So conservatives, and he was a hero. I mean, not even just conservatives. People generally looked at MacArthur as a hero of World War II, helped rebuild Japan. But the problem was he and Truman didn't agree, and MacArthur, you got to say, pushed the limits. Well, Truman asserted his authority as commander-in-chief, said, you know what, I'm relieving you of your command, and that's it. And you could say that you know, not restored, but solidified the power of a civilian commander-in-chief of the armed forces in the office of the presidency. So this war was also fought without congressional approval because it was a UN police action. And because of that, you know, there wasn't exactly an overall big war effort per se. Also, for the first time, there were desegregated military units. Why? Because Harry Truman voted for the desegregation, or not voted for, he did it in an executive order, desegregating the armed forces in 1947. The war ended with Dwight D. Eisenhower's administration. He will be elected president in 1952. Harry Truman won't run again. And Eisenhower defeat Adlai Stevenson, the governor of Illinois, and as the commander of Allied forces in World War II, one of the things that he did say that he was going to find an end to this war in Korea. And not too far into his first term, he was able to put forth the armistice at the 38th parallel again, where today the United States and South Koreans still hold troops there. We all know North Korea with the Kim family. We're at the third generation of Kims, and looks like right now we're at the brink of some sort of major military action where the United States has a Pacific Fleet sending a bunch of ships around North Korea, and we also have about 150 to 200,000 Chinese troops at the north of the Korean border. The question is, are the Chinese going to be doing an operation with the United States, or are they there to defend North Korea? Some people believe that they're going to be working with the United States to stop this nuclear threat in North Korea with this Kim, whatever his name is, Jong-un. And this is a pretty serious development that's going on right now. There's also this Munich analogy in the United States government and the military circles after Munich, and this whole idea of not appeasing dictators. And this fear of appeasing Russian leaders was a powerful motive for U.S. presidents. You look at Chamberlain with Hitler and with the Munich Accords, or the Munich Conference, where Chamberlain appeased Hitler and that led to World War II. There's this fear you can't appease Joseph Stalin, and then later on, under Eisenhower, Nikita Khrushchev You can't appease them, or they will take advantage of that. So this whole concept of Cold War liberalism, and you have Truman and the end of reform, okay? Cold War liberalism, what's the definition? Preservation of New Deal programs. That means preserve them, don't expand them. Preserve the New Deal programs from the 1930s, as well as a containment policy, which is very expensive with a military buildup. After NSC 68, containment is expensive. You have to massively build up the armed forces in order to be able to execute this type of containment strategy, looking at communism and the Soviet Union as the one calling the shots, looking to expand worldwide communism. So there isn't any money or any political will to expand on the New Deal social fabric. Many union members went on strike post-World War II because wages were stagnant. They were still resonating from price controls during World War II. And again, there was going to be a tough transformation from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy. The Taft-Hartley Act outlawed the closed shop and allowed right-to-work laws. This was able to get through both houses of Congress and be overturned from Truman's veto. Non-union members could work in union jobs. So closed shop means that certain places you go to work, you must join the union. You don't have a choice. You can't decide not to join the union. Right to work laws is the opposite of closed shop, that you have a choice. And a lot of this is happening in a lot of states now with these right to work laws, even in public employee unions, where some states are implementing that. And it's meant to, by some to say, to break up the unions and be able to, be able to divide that. With others, is to make things more affordable, to be able to have services and have things done at a more affordable rate. And if you look at the picture here, Mr. President vetoed the Hartley-Taft bill, and then also there's a nice political cartoon that you can look at there that has to do with these right-to-work laws and the closed versus these closed shops. So the 1948 election, the Democrat Party was split. The Dixiecrats nominated Strom Thurmond on a segregationist platform, upset with the desegregation of the military, and a push by Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota to really push the envelope on desegregation. Harry Truman's going to defeat Dewey in an upset. And why it's an upset is because all the polls show Dewey walking away with this. And when you looked at the east coast of the country, with the Dixiecrats taking away some key southern states, South Carolina, Thurmond took, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and took an electoral vote from Tennessee. You start looking at this, it's going to be a problem. But what ended up happening is Truman swept in the West. The only state that he lost in the West, far West, was Oregon, if you look at the map there. So if you went to bed before the West Coast came in, the numbers didn't come in as fast as it does now. Okay? Took a while. It looked like that Dewey was going to win this race. It's a famous Chicago Tribune that says Dewey defeats Truman. There's a famous picture of Truman holding that picture up, the big smile on his face, like, yeah, okay. So Truman gets reelected and upset. And the way he did this, Dewey believed, what everyone was saying, it's going to be a cakewalk. Truman's, in over his head. And, Dewey ran a strong race against Truman in 1944. Against FDR in 1944. He's the sitting governor of New York. He's that moderate that moderate Republican. Such a better choice than Truman. Well, Dewey kind of just sat back and wrote it out. Didn't want to make any mistakes to make sure that he wins. Well, Truman hit the road and did a whistle-stop tour on a train and went to hundreds of cities giving stump speeches, saying that the Congress, the Republican Congress, was a do-nothing Congress, and If you re-elect me and elect Democrats, we'll get things done, blah, 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 blah. It kept going, and what the polls didn't pick up was the weekend before the election, there was a massive surge for Harry Truman across the country, and the pollsters didn't pick that up. And actually, that's what happened in 2016. There was a big surge for Donald Trump in the last 4 to 5 days. Some of the polls picked it up, other ones, I just think they were garbage polls. So it wasn't picked up, and Harry Truman, wins this in an upset. So you have the square deal from TR, you have the New Deal from FDR. Now you have Truman. You want talking about a fair deal, and within that fair deal, Truman would propose national health insurance, money for education, increased Social Security, and raising the minimum wage. This is the first time really seriously by a president national health insurance was proposed. The first presidential candidate to push for national health insurance was Theodore Roosevelt in 1912 with his overall program and his 1912 platform with the Progressive Party. Obviously that didn't happen because Wilson won that election. But this is the first time that national health insurance was put on and proposed legislation for Congress to consider. Only thing basically Truman is going to get is a little bit of an increase in Social Security and possibly a little bit on the minimum wage. Most of those proposals were rejected, especially the national health insurance, the money for education. Education was always deemed as a state and local function, not a federal function. It's always been considered a reserve power of the states. There are many today that believes that we should go back to that. Then there's the Red Scare, the hunt for the communists. Some government employees and aides to Franklin Roosevelt provided the Soviet Union with information. The Venona files released in the early 90s by the Soviet Union proves that a lot of those that were accused of being communists or aiding the communists and, basically committing treason, giving information to the Soviets, it was true. During the time, it was called the witch hunt and other things, and I think your book definitely puts that stuff out there, but the book still goes through pains to make it look like that it still was a witch hunt. Well, there was definitely some serious Soviet communist subversion in the American government, and they were calling the shots. Your book shows that they were calling the shots with the United States Communist Party, the American Communist Party, that there was a concerted effort by the Soviets to get into Hollywood films and get some of their ideas of collectivism and things into film. It was going on. The question is to the extent and how you handle it. So you have this loyal security program, which is Executive Order 9835 by Truman. The government employees could be investigated for subversive activity. And this put chills through a lot of people that work for the government. Well, what is subversive activity? Well, they say it's communism. Well, that's not what the executive order says. So many people were concerned that they would be investigated for subversive activity more for political reasons versus really trying to root out communists from the government. Then you have the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC. Okay. Richard Nixon was a prominent member of this. Richard Nixon made his career on anti-communism. Your book starts out about the 1950 senatorial election. You have an unknown Congressman, Richard Nixon, versus the Democrat, a 3-term Congresswoman who was also a Hollywood actress, very well known. Nixon's going to call the Pink Lady, and he's going to defeat her with that by 20 points. So the anti-communist message is going to be very, very powerful, particularly for Republicans against Democrats in many states during this period of time. Nixon held public hearings on suspected communists. Then you have the Hollywood 10. You have Alger Hiss, convicted of perjury, spent 5 years in jail. The Hollywood 10 were 10 people that pleaded the fifth, that would not talk about their associations with communists and the Communist Party. There were a lot in Hollywood that were involved in the Communist Party because the communists were very good at organizing unions and organizing labor. And they were infiltrating unions in the 30s and the 40s. A lot of these Hollywood 10's origins with the communists were back in the 1930s during the Depression. Some of them, I guess, may argue they weren't affiliated with them anymore, but then again, I mean, the ones that didn't talk, you wonder why, they wouldn't cooperate. Maybe there was something to the concerns and the accusations, maybe not. Alger Hiss, someone Nixon went after strongly with HUAC, was convicted of perjury and spent 5 years in jail. And the Venona papers show that Hiss was definitely an informant for the Soviets. Definitely, for sure. So, you could say straight out that he was a traitor. You can definitely say that too. And you have McCarthyism. And there's a big picture there of Joseph McCarthy pointing on a map of all this Communist Party activity around the country. He accused over 200 government officials of being Communist Party members, and his charges were often aimed at Democrats. And his downfall came when he attacked the U.S. military and was seen as a bully. But here's the thing. A lot of the people he accused, he was right. Now, history also shows he wasn't 100% sure if he was. So he went for it. And there were some that were accused that he was dead wrong about. But for years and years and years in history books, it says, well, it was just a witch hunt. He just went after people with no evidence, and for the most part, it wasn't true. Well, it was true. So a lot of them were, involved in that. But when he attacked the U.S. Army in particular, and it was on TV, one of the first congressional hearings ever televised in the early days of TV. And when people saw how he treated these individuals, his popularity, McCarthy's popularity, went down big time. To the point that the Senate would censure him. Only 22 senators at the time voted against censure. Almost 70 did. Some didn't vote. Politics of Cold War liberalism, the modern republicanism, is this moderating of New Deal programs. This would be Eisenhower. He'll look at the New Deal programs and be like, okay, they're here. How can we moderate them? Maybe make them less expensive and a little bit, less, let's say, aggressive. A little less liberal or socialistic or whatever way you want to look at it. Eisenhower was a moderate. Okay? He had the conservative wing of the Republican Party led by Senator Robert Taft, who will run for president 3 times but never get the Republican nomination. He was very conservative. He was against NATO. He was against, he wanted to get rid of all the New Deal programs. He was a constitutional conservative, an economic conservative, and believed that the role of the federal government should be limited and should not be involved in social legislation, like what the New Deal was. America under Eisenhower, this new look defense policy, it increased the military buildup, but with nuclear weapons. And the reason Eisenhower did this is that nuclear weapons were cheaper. They weren't as expensive as raising, clothing, arming, and putting in barracks conventional forces. Much more expensive to build up conventional forces. That's tanks, men, guns, planes, versus a nuclear arsenal. Much more lethal and petrifying, but a lot cheaper. And Eisenhower privately, with the Soviets, on multiple occasions would threaten the use of nuclear weapons with them. That will change when it becomes very clear that the Russians have the same technology the Soviets have, the hydrogen bomb and other things. But Eisenhower wouldn't have a problem maybe making that suggestion that maybe one of those nukes will get dropped. So, Massive retaliation. The U.S. would respond with more force if attacked. And they'll call it the Ron Burgundy that escalated quickly. It's pretty funny. The Cold War and colonial independence. Revolutions in the third world, today we call the developing world countries, were often regarded as pawns of the Soviet Union. It was assumed if a country is not doing well economically, they will be sympathetic to the collectivist, communist message. So the United States is going to push together the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization known as CETO. It's basically an Asian NATO to try to get nations to counteract or be against communist expansion in Asia. Truman and Eisenhower sometimes supported repressive governments as long as they were anti-communist. So other kinds of dictators, no problem. Other types of autocratic governments, as long as they were anti-communist, was fine. The CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, which was created in the late 40s, overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh, that was elected Iran and basically their prime minister, and Jacob Arbenz Guzman in Guatemala. So the CIA would support and train coups d'etats against elected officials in countries that were seen not to be favorable towards the United States. The reason Mossadegh was overthrown is because he wanted to nationalize the petroleum in Iran, which was basically claimed and owned by British Petroleum and was seen to a threat to the world's oil supply and oil prices. Arbenz in Guatemala was more for U.S. control within the orbit of Latin America. In Vietnam, Vietnam was once a French colony, and Ho Chi Minh, a communist, sought to unite Vietnam. The Dien Bien Phu, this was the French defeat in 1954, left Vietnam, and the U.S. increased its presence. This was brutal. The French, pretty much almost to the man, was slaughtered. There was only a couple handfuls of men that survived this. French. I knew one of the men. He didn't really talk about it, but he mentioned to me. His name was Sergio. I forgot his last name. He owned a lumber yard, a specialty lumber yard called Clyde Cabinet in West Warwick, Rhode Island. He fought in Dien Bien Phu and made it out of there alive. And it completely defined. The guy was a little wacky, but he had the best lumber. I mean, if you had to build something and you wanted good oak or whatever else it was, and this guy, when I sold him lumber, if one little piece was crooked, the guy he wouldn't go crazy, but he was so fussy. I remember him, but I was amazed when he was telling me this, because I didn't really know much back then when I was young about Dien Bien Phu, and he didn't get into too much detail, but to actually say that I met someone that survived that from the French Foreign Legion is pretty rare. He's gone now. He left us probably 20 years ago. But Vietnam's going to be abandoned by the French. Are like, we're out of here. So the U.S. is going to increase its presence. In the Middle East, the U.S. recognized Israel almost immediately. When Israel declared the State of Israel after the UN partition resolution, where they were going to partition Palestine and Israel, and this is where the lines are going to be. There's going to be a nation for Palestine, nation Israel. Well, the Palestinians will reject the overall plan by the UN. The Israelis are going to jump right on and say, okay, yep, here's our country, we accept. And it's going to be 30, 40, 50 years where the Palestinians will refuse to recognize the existence of Israel, because they wouldn't even recognize the lines drawn by the United Nations back in 1947-48. The Egyptian President Nasser is going to nationalize the Suez Canal. Britain and France are going to attack, and Eisenhower is going to help end the conflict. Well, Nasser is going to become basically the military dictator, socialist military dictator of Egypt. Egypt's going to get its independence from Great Britain in 1952. I think NASA will be in power by 1954. And part of that, hey, we have control of the Suez. Now we have some leverage in the region because everybody wanted to go through the Suez Canal to move their oil. Well, Britain and France are not going to have any of that. Of course, Eisenhower will sit back and help end the conflict to make sure that the ships keep on going through the Suez Canal. Keep that flow of oil going. So without oil, you don't have an economy in the 20th century. Then you have the Eisenhower Doctrine. This is different from the Truman Doctrine. The U.S. will help countries in the Middle East that resisted communism. The Eisenhower Doctrine is specific to the Middle East. And Russia is going to work very hard to get its orbit there. The only places they're really going to have, well, early on, they're going to have a lot of success. They're going to have, Egypt's going to be close to their orbit. That will change in the 60s. Syria, even to this day, been part of the Russian orbit, and we know that there's a lot of things going on in Syria, and the Russians are still involved with that. Also, the Soviets were very close to Iran, and still to this day. So there's the Cold War went to the Middle East for sure, and the United States is going to work. Even early Israel got military assistance from the Soviets, but that will switch pretty quickly to the United States. John F. Kennedy in the Cold War and the election of 1960 in the New Frontier. During these 1960 debates, JFK won to those who watched on TV. Nixon won to those that listened. JFK is going to win in a close election. Richard Nixon's not going to come off well on TV. His first debate, I believe, he was just recovering from the hospital from the flu. Had a 5 o'clock shadow going on. I think I told you the story how JFK basically fooled him into not using makeup in the debates, making him think that only gay actors use makeup before they go on TV. I think I told you that story, how he played that. You understand, John F. Kennedy was very, very, very good at playing his opponents in different ways. He was a good politician. One thing that JFK did claim, which wasn't true, is that the United States was suffering from a missile gap, that the Soviets had more missiles than the United States did, and it was something profound. It was actually not true, but a lot of people believed it. And John F. Kennedy, you could say, was the coldest of the Cold Warriors for sure. You want to talk about Cold War liberalism? JFK would be the poster child to the extreme of that. He's actually going to try early on to build upon the New Deal and expand, but it's not going to happen. It's going to be rejected early. And then he'll do massive tax cuts that will increase a lot of revenue, like we talked about in the 1920s with Mellon. That's going to help Lyndon Johnson simultaneously pay for the Great Society and the Vietnam War at the same time. So I know we're going ahead here, but so JFK is going to win in a close election. If you swing Texas, where Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy's running mate, the sitting Senate Majority Leader, and you swing Illinois, Richard Nixon was the next president. Now, Richard Nixon knew on election night that there was some serious campaign fraud in Chicago, particularly Cook County, where Chicago is, with the Giancana mob family and the Daily Machine. There were also reports that there were votes, voting boxes showed up mysteriously in Texas. Lyndon Johnson won his Senate primary back in 1948 that way by, making some ballot box appear in San Antonio County. There was evidence. The Republicans had a lot of evidence of voter fraud, but Richard Nixon decided not to challenge the election because a few months before with the U-2 spy incident, where there was a U-2 plane taking spy pictures over the Soviet Union, was shot down, and the United States continued to lie about the U-2 spy missions, and then of course Khrushchev on TV shows up with the pilot that they shot down. It was very embarrassing for Eisenhower, showing him as a liar. When it came to these things, none of them told the truth. For national security reasons, you can see why Eisenhower would not tell the truth or lie about that. So Richard Nixon was very concerned. Everything was on high alert, per se, in the Cold War. The tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were dire. So the last thing Nixon wanted to do for the country, and again, I'm not giving pats on the back to Richard Nixon. I've told you guys many times in class, he's one of my most disliked, and I think I've used the word hate a couple times, president. I have a lot of problems with Richard Nixon, but he did the right thing here. Because I think a contested election of voter fraud that was very close in the midst of the heat of the Cold War, which was very, very hot at the time, or very, very cold at the time, was probably not a good idea. So he decided not to challenge the election. He said, I'm young, I'll have another day, which he does. 8 years later, he'll make his big comeback and be elected president. Kennedy's New Frontier called for the advancements in science and Americans to achieve their fullest, but make no mistake, if you listen to JFK's first inaugural address, it's a Cold War speech. It's very strong, very anti-communist, and made it very clear to the Soviet Union and to Khrushchev that the United States will act when necessary. So JFK is going to have some blunders and some problems. There's going to be a crisis in Cuba and Berlin. Fidel Castro is going to overthrow the Batista regime in 1959, and he's a communist, and it was supported by the Soviets. And there's a plan that was already in place by the Eisenhower administration with the CIA, known as the Bay of Pigs, and it was attempted to take Cuban nationals, or Cuban refugees, train them and assist them on invading Cuba and to take the country back. It was to try to overthrow Castro in 1961. It was a huge, huge failure. It was actually really embarrassing. And one of the mistakes that Kennedy did is he severely hampered the air support. And when you don't have air support when you're trying to invade on a beachhead, and you don't have enough air support, it's not good. A lot of CIA people thought that Kennedy botched this up and did not give them the proper air support they needed to be successful, and believed that they were, in lack of a better term, thrown under the bus. And this was a real problem, and it caused a lot of tension and problems between Kennedy and the CIA moving forward. It was also seen as a sign of weakness. It was a big failure for the United States, and a lot of historians believe that it's going to embolden Nikita Khrushchev to really do some things that's going to lead to an even bigger crisis. Khrushchev began construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 to keep East Berliners from fleeing. So you're going to put up a wall to keep people from leaving. That's interesting. That's what you do in prisons. Also in October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis is the closest the two sides come to war in the history of the Cold War from 1945 to 1991. A lot of historians will say that Khrushchev saw the Bay of Pigs disaster as weakness, and it gave Khrushchev the guts or the wherewithal to decide to put nuclear bombs and nuclear weapon missile sites in Cuba, which is 90 miles off the coast of the United States. Spy planes caught them. Kennedy went to the American people, and it got very, 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 very close to nuclear war. We'll have more of a discussion. We're going to listen to a couple conversations, look at a couple things on the Cuban Missile Crisis next class. The U.S. agreed to remove missiles from Turkey, and then the Soviets promised to remove missiles from Cuba. That was the deal. The missiles in Turkey that are aimed at the Soviet Union will go away, which was close to the Soviet border, and then the USSR promised to remove missiles. This deal almost didn't happen for a bunch of different reasons. Kennedy and the World, the Peace Corps. You have a 2-year commitment by Americans to volunteer in third world or developing countries and regions, and this was believed if you bring young people to help those in those countries, they will not turn communist. There was definitely a Cold War calculation to this. Teaching social and economic development. If you teach economic development to these countries, they will not be desperate and then look to collectivism and communism for their country. 1957, Sputnik, and then April 12, 1961, with Yuri Gagarin, What happened, Sputnik was the satellite. The Soviets put the first satellite into orbit, 61. Yuri Gagarin is going to be the first human in space. The Russians are ahead of the United States on this game when it comes to space. And it's going to finally give the impetus for the government and for the United States to really concentrate on science, physics, and really beef up science programs in public schools. Basically, that was decimated from the Scopes trial and the whole fundamentalist type of deal on how to deal with, not teaching evolution and that kind of stuff. Science took a real step back for 40 years. Well, not 40 years, but close, 35 years. Now, after Sputnik and the Soviets ahead on these scientific achievements in space, is going to turn that whole trajectory around for science education in the United States. Again, increased spending not only on science but education in general. We're behind the Soviets. That's not good. Let's fix that. Making a commitment in Vietnam, JFK's increased military aid to South Vietnam. Special forces will be training South Vietnamese troops in South Vietnam. Was led by this guy Diem, who was a corrupt, autocratic dictator. But again, he wasn't communist. That was the key. So the United States burped them up and propped them up and kept them in there. But eventually, JFK is going to have the CIA work on a coup that was going to kill him and his brother. And then it's going to turn Vietnam into a chaotic state. But JFK will not live to see the seeds that were sown there, because he'll be assassinated himself on November 22nd, 1963, 3 weeks to the day of the Diem coup, murder of him and his brother. So, quick recap. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. You need to know what those are. The Truman Doctrine it has to do with containment, particularly with Greece and Turkey, and the Marshall Plan of putting money into European countries to prop up their economies, but to make their economies capitalist, being a trading partner with the United States. But the whole idea was, if you do that, they're not going to turn communist. The Berlin airlift, that was an extraordinary achievement. When the Soviets shut down the roads, it was brought in by the air, and 2.5 million tons of food and supplies would be airlifted into Berlin during that time, and Stalin finally gave up. The North American Treaty Organization, known as NATO, which still exists today, was for the Western Bloc, or the so-called free countries, free Europe, the United States and free Europe. The Korean War, which was a, quote, police action, unquote, sanctioned by the United Nations. The only reason it was is because Russia was not involved in the United Nations in protest that China was not allowed to be part of the United Nations or the Security Council. And this was not a congressional approved. This is known as the Lost War, the Forgotten War, because nobody won. Thousands of Americans died. Then at the end of it, it was a stalemate, and we're still there at the 30th parallel today. The 1948 election was a shocker. Harry Truman wins in his own right against the governor of New York, Thomas Dewey. Thomas Dewey's second time going out there, but guess what? Truman worked hard, went to the people, traveled and worked hard, and was able to put forth a surprise upset, a pretty solid one too. McCarthyism and the Second Red Scare. Again, remember, a lot of these accusations were true. Not all of them. Because, again, there was a scare. People were frightened of the Soviets' aggressiveness within the United States. And they were supporting the Communist Party and the different parts of the Communist Party. They were training people to be, protesters and political operatives, and to organize unions, and as they're organizing unions, and to infiltrate the unions and labor and infiltrate the writings and stuff for propaganda purposes in Hollywood. It was happening. The Cold War and Eisenhower, and how Eisenhower dealt with it. Eisenhower was not going to spend time on conventional forces. He's going to work on building the nuclear capability because it was more economical. And again, he didn't have a problem kind of threatening quietly to use it. The election of 1960, John F. Kennedy's going to defeat Richard Nixon in a very, very close election, controversial election, I guess you could say. But Kennedy ran as a Cold Warrior, young man as a Cold Warrior, much more than Nixon, claiming there was a missile gap, which really wasn't true, but, it worked. And Cuba. Cuba is going to be a problem with the Bay of Pigs and then the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Cuba's still communist today. So that's it for that. Any questions, be sure to email me on Chapter 25. And have a good one until next time. Thanks.